The red dust of Wyoming was a currency of its own, settling on everything and everyone in Pine Gulch with a fine, gritty film. It coated the warped boards of Enoch Pike's trading post, seeped through the cracks in the window panes, and dusted the shoulders of the men who lingered inside, nursing lukewarm coffee and stale grudges. Outside, the autumn wind made a lonely complaint as it turned the blades of a tired windmill, each metallic creak a tick of the clock counting down the seconds of Eliza Wynn's life. She stood by the counter, a silent fixture between a barrel of pickles and a stack of stiff canvas trousers. At 18, she had learned the art of making herself small, of observing without being seen. Her hands, though chapped and calloused from a life of thankless labor, were folded calmly over her patched calico dress. Inside, her heart beat a frantic, trapped rhythm against her ribs. She was property, a ledger entry in the account book of her guardian, the sanctimonious Deacon Enoch Pike. And today, the account was being settled. Pike cleared his throat, a wet, gravelly sound that drew the attention of the half-dozen men in the store. He was a man whose piety was as thin as his hair, a veneer for the hard-edged avarice that glinted in his eyes. He rested a proprietary hand on Eliza's shoulder, his thumb pressing just hard enough to remind her of her place. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice projecting the false warmth of a preacher at a collection plate. "By the grace of God and the turning of the seasons, young Eliza has reached the age of womanhood, 18 years old today." He paused, letting the information settle. A few men shifted, their eyes sweeping over Eliza with a new, speculative interest. She kept her gaze fixed on a knot in the floorboards, feeling their stares like physical things, like dirty hands. "As her legal and spiritual guardian," Pike continued, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, commercial tone, "it is my duty to see her settled in a respectable, godly home, a helpmeet for a man of good standing." He gave her shoulder a little shake. "And so, she is given, at 18, she is given virgin and untouched, fit for a godly home." The words hung in the dusty air, stark and ugly. They were a butcher's assessment of a prize heifer. A low chuckle rumbled from a grizzled prospector near the stove. Luther Maddox, the cattle baron whose shadow fell over the entire territory, watched from his chair in the corner, a smirk playing on his lips. He wasn't interested in the goods, but he always enjoyed a good auction. His lapdog, Sheriff Caleb Rusk, stood beside him, his hand resting on his gun butt, a silent affirmation of where the real power in Pine Gulch lay. Eliza felt a wave of nausea. This was it, the culmination of a life spent as an orphan, passed from one begrudging relative to another until she'd landed under Pike's thumb, his ward, his unpaid servant. Her supposed freedom upon turning 18 was a cruel joke. Freedom required money, a place to go. She had neither. Her options were this: a transaction in a dusty store, or being turned out with nothing, which in this country was a death sentence of a different kind. She would swallow this humiliation, just as she had swallowed 1,000 others. She would survive. The front door creaked open, letting in a slice of cold, sharp sunlight and the scent of pine. The man who entered silenced the room. He was not of Pine Gulch. He was tall and broad, dressed in smoked buckskins that had seen years of hard use. His black hair was tied back with a leather thong, and his face was all angles and planes, weathered by sun and wind. There was a stillness about him, an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived far from the clumsy hustle of town. But it was his eyes that held the room captive dark, watchful and betraying nothing. And on his hip he carried no pistol, only a long, heavy knife. Tucked behind his legs, peering out with a mixture of fear and curiosity, were 2 small children, a boy and a girl, no older than 5. They were mirror images of each other, with the same dark hair as the man and eyes so wide they seemed to take in the entire world at once. The girl clutched a fold of his buckskin trousers, while the boy stood a half step behind, his small face a mask of solemn observation. The whispers started immediately. "Crow, the mountain man. Half-breed." Asa Crow paid them no mind. His gaze swept the room once, dismissed the other men, and settled on Enoch Pike. Then, for a brief, startling moment, his eyes met Eliza's. There was no pity in them, no judgment. There was only a quiet, assessing look, as if he were measuring a length of rope or the depth of a river. Eliza found she could not look away. He moved to the counter, the children trailing him like a pair of shadows. With a single, fluid motion, he reached into a pouch at his belt and placed a heavy deerskin bag on the scarred wood. It landed with a solid, definitive thud of silver. Beside it, he laid a folded piece of paper, its edges worn, its surface covered in official-looking script. Pike's eyes, greedy and bright, darted from the bag to the man. "Crow, what business brings you down from your mountain?" "I heard your announcement," Asa Crow said. His voice was low and even, a rumble that seemed to come from his chest. It held no hint of the lilting drawl of the town's men, but a clipped, clear cadence. He gestured with his chin toward Eliza. "You're selling her." "I am providing her a home," Pike corrected, puffing out his chest. "A contract of marriage, you might say, a domestic arrangement." "Call it what you will," Asa said, his voice unchanging. He nudged the bag of silver forward. "There's payment. For her contract. And for supplies." He tapped the folded paper. "This is the court order from Cheyenne. It grants me full guardianship of the children. My sister's children." The mention of the court order sent a ripple through the room. Law was a flexible thing out here, but a paper from the territorial capital carried weight. Across the room, Eliza saw Luther Maddox lean forward slightly. His eyes narrowed, no longer smirking. He wasn't looking at Asa or the silver. He was looking at the paper. An official document in the hands of a reclusive mountain man was an anomaly, and Maddox didn't like anomalies. Pike licked his lips, his gaze fixed on the silver. The sum was clearly more than he had expected. He reached for it, but Asa placed a hand flat on the counter, stopping him. "The terms," Asa said, his voice dropping even lower, cutting through the silence. "I need someone who won't leave when the first snow flies. Someone to tend the hearth and the children." He paused, and his dark eyes found Eliza's again, pinning her in place. "But hear this. Pike, and everyone else, no one is to harm the children, ever." The words were not a threat, but a statement of fact, as unshakable as the mountains at his back. In that moment, Eliza understood. This wasn't about a wife, not in the way these other men understood the word. This was about the two small souls hiding behind him. The silver wasn't a bride price. It was the foundation for a fortress. Pike, blinded by the shine of the coins, readily agreed. Of course. A fine, Christian sentiment. The girl is yours. Crow, she knows her duties." He turned to Eliza, his face a mask of smug finality. "Eliza, you'll go with Mr. Crow." This was her moment of choice, though it felt like anything but. She could refuse. She could scream and fight and be thrown into the dusty street with nothing but the clothes on her back, to be picked over by the coyotes in human skin who inhabited this town. Or she could walk into the wilderness with a silent stranger and two orphaned children. She looked at Asa Crow, at the impassive set of his jaw. She looked at the little girl, who was now peeking at her around his leg, her thumb in her mouth. She looked at the little boy, whose solemn gaze seemed to see right through her. It was a trade of one cage for another, but this new cage had a window, and beyond it lay the vast, clean expanse of the Bighorn Mountains. It was a desperate gamble, but it was her gamble. Straightening her spine, Eliza gave a single, sharp nod. Asa returned the nod, just as curt. He scooped the guardianship paper off the counter and slid the bag of silver toward Pike, who snatched it up like a hungry dog. "Get your things," Asa said to her. It was a command, but his voice was not unkind. "I have nothing but this," Eliza replied, her own voice sounding thin and reedy to her ears. Asa's gaze flickered over her worn dress and scuffed boots. He said nothing, simply turned and walked toward the door. The little girl, May, took his hand. The boy, Jonah, hesitated for a second, his dark eyes meeting Eliza's once more before he turned to follow his father. As Eliza moved to follow them, she felt the weight of every eye in the room on her back. She heard the whispers, the snickers, the judgment. She was the girl sold to the half-breed, the town's latest piece of sordid gossip. She pushed past it all, her focus narrowing to the wide back of the man waiting for her in the doorway. Outside, the cold air was a shock. Asa had a sturdy sled packed high with supplies, flour, salt, tools, blankets hitched to a pair of strong mules. He lifted the children onto a space cleared among the provisions, tucking a thick buffalo robe around them. He didn't offer Eliza a hand. He simply waited, expecting her to manage on her own. She clambered up, settling herself near the back, pulling her thin shawl tight against the biting wind. Asa took the reins, and with a low word to the mules, set them in motion. The sled runners slid over the hard-packed dirt, leaving the trading post and the jeering faces behind. They moved through the center of Pine Gulch, a silent, strange procession that drew stares from every doorway. Eliza kept her head high, her gaze fixed forward, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of her shame. The town fell away quickly, replaced by the sparse, rugged beauty of the high plains. The trail began to climb, winding its way into the foothills of the Bighorn Range. The air grew thinner, cleaner, smelling of pine and cold stone. The incessant creak of the windmill was gone, replaced by the sigh of the wind through the tall pines and the soft crunch of the sled on the path. Silence stretched between them, vast and profound. Asa did not speak, his attention wholly on the trail ahead. The children were quiet, nestled in their warm cocoon. Eliza watched the landscape change. The world she had known, the dust, the humiliation, the suffocating piety of Enoch Pike shrinking behind her. As the sled rounded a high bend, the last rooftops of Pine Gulch disappeared from view. There was nothing now but the endless blue sky above, the snow-dusted peaks ahead, and the three strangers with whom her life was now bound. Her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. A future of complete uncertainty lay before her, but for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt the faintest whisper of something she had long forgotten. A choice had been made, and she would not look back. The journey upward was a silent ascent into another world. The dusty reds and browns of the plains gave way to the deep greens of pine and the stark gray of granite. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and cold orange, the trail opened into a small, sheltered meadow. There, nestled against a sheer rock face as if growing from the mountain itself, was the cabin. It was not a shack. It was a solid, deliberate structure of interlocking logs and skillfully fitted stone, with a low-pitched roof and a chimney that breathed a thin, welcoming plume of smoke. A stream, steaming faintly in the frigid air, gurgled past the front porch, its banks free of the ice that was beginning to coat everything else. To one side stood a mountain of chopped firewood, stacked high and neat, a testament to months of relentless labor. Further on, Eliza could make out a small, windowless smokehouse and the faint lines of a trail that disappeared into the timber. The trap line. This was not a temporary camp. It was a fortress against the wilderness, built with patience and foresight. Asa brought the sled to a halt. Without a word, he swung down and lifted a sleeping May into his arms. Jonah, awake and watchful, slid down on his own and stood waiting. Asa glanced at Eliza. "This is it." The inside was one large room, dominated by a stone fireplace that radiated a deep, bone-soaking warmth. It was spare, but clean and orderly. 2 small beds for the children were built into one wall. A larger bed, clearly Asa's, occupied a corner. A sturdy table and 2 benches sat in the center. Every object had a purpose, the cast-iron pots hanging by the hearth, the rifles resting on a wooden rack, the snowshoes hanging by the door. There was no clutter, no softness, save for the worn bearskin rugs on the floor. Asa placed May gently on her bed and pulled a thick wool blanket over her. He then looked at Eliza, who stood uncertainly by the door, still wrapped in her thin shawl. His gaze went to a small cot tucked into the alcove farthest from his own bed. "That's yours," he said. He gestured to a hook on the wall beside it. "For your things." The gesture was small, but it was the first space Eliza had ever been given that was truly her own. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her, relief so profound it almost buckled her knees, and the bitter, shameful reminder that this small comfort had been bought and paid for with a bag of silver. She was not a guest. She was an acquisition. She swallowed the feeling down and gave a curt nod, moving to the cot as if claiming a piece of territory. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Asa rose before dawn, his movements quiet and efficient as he stoked the fire and left to check his trap lines. He expected the cabin to be warm, the coffee to be hot, and a simple breakfast to be ready upon his return. These were unspoken rules, and Eliza, a student of survival, learned them quickly. She learned the specific way he liked his coffee, boiled with a pinch of salt. She learned to bank the fire at night so a bed of hot coals remained in the morning. She learned the weight and balance of the cast-iron skillet, the smell of baking Johnny cakes, the subtle art of making a filling stew from smoked trout and dried vegetables. Her world shrank to the confines of this cabin, this meadow, this mountain, but within that world, she began to expand. Asa left her to her duties, never hovering, never criticizing. The silence between them was a constant presence. Yet it was not the hostile silence she had known with Pike. It was a stillness born of solitude, the comfortable quiet of 2 people working toward a common goal: survival. The children were the bridge across that silence. May, bold and endlessly curious, quickly attached herself to Eliza. She would follow her around the cabin, chattering about the shapes she saw in the clouds or bringing her treasures of oddly shaped stones and bright feathers. It was May who showed her how to brew a fragrant tea from pine needles, a trick she'd learned from her uncle. Jonah was a different matter. He was his father's shadow, quiet and observant. He watched Eliza with an unnerving intensity, his dark eyes missing nothing. He rarely spoke to her directly, but she would often find a perfectly shaped piece of kindling left by the hearth or a bucket of fresh water brought from the stream without her asking. It was his silent, solemn way of vetting her, of deciding if she was a permanent fixture or a passing storm. One crisp afternoon, a week after her arrival, Asa returned from his work earlier than usual. He found Eliza outside, scrubbing laundry in a tub of hot water diverted from the spring. He watched her for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked. "The nights are getting colder," he said, making her jump. "Winter will be here before the next full moon. You need to know how to protect this place, and them." He nodded toward the cabin, where the children were playing by the fire. He went inside and returned with one of the rifles from the rack, a Winchester carbine that looked small and light in his powerful hands. He held it out to her. "You know how to use one of these?" Eliza shook her head, wiping her wet hands on her apron. The only gun she had ever touched was Pike's old shotgun, and only to clean it. "Time you learned," he said. He spent the next hour showing her, his instructions clear and concise. He showed her how to load, how to aim, how to brace the stock against her shoulder to absorb the kick. His hands never touched her, yet she was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the smell of leather and pine and cold mountain air. He set up a tin can on a distant stump. Don't think, just breathe out and squeeze, he instructed. Eliza lifted the rifle. It was heavier than it looked, cold and unforgiving. She lined up the sights, remembering his words. The blast was deafening. The kick a hard punch to her shoulder that sent her stumbling back. The can remained untouched. A hot flush of failure crept up her neck. Again, was all he said. She loaded the rifle again, her fingers clumsy. She ignored her stinging shoulder, focused on the small target, and squeezed the trigger. The can flew off the stump, spinning into the air. A small, fierce thrill shot through her. It was a feeling she'd never known before, a sense of power, of agency. This piece of wood and steel gave her a voice in a world that had always tried to silence her. Asa gave a single, approving nod. "You'll do," he said, and took the rifle back. It was the closest he had ever come to a compliment, and it warmed her more than the fire inside. But the shame was a persistent ghost in the quiet moments. When she was mending the children's clothes or sweeping the hearth, the memory of Pike's words would return, given virgin and untouched. She was a commodity. This quiet respect from Asa, this burgeoning affection from May, Jonah's slow-thawing watchfulness. Did it all hinge on the fact that she hadn't been touched, that her contract was being fulfilled? The thought soured everything, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. She worked harder, kept the cabin cleaner, cooked better meals, as if her diligence could somehow pay down a debt she never agreed to incur. One evening, searching for a rag in a storage chest, her fingers brushed against a pile of small, worn-out clothes. May's dress from when she was a toddler. Jonah's first pair of trousers, now hopelessly ripped. They were the remnants of a life that had existed before her, a life that held a deep, unspoken sorrow. On an impulse, she took them out. She found a sewing kit and, by the light of the fire, began to cut the usable cloth into squares. She had seen women in Pine Gulch working on quilts, their needles flying as they gossiped. For Eliza, it was a silent, solitary act. She laid out the squares on the floor, a piece of faded blue gingham from May's dress next to a square of sturdy brown wool from Jonah's trousers. A piece of soft flannel, probably from a baby's blanket, lay beside a scrap of calico she recognized as belonging to Asa's deceased sister, a woman she'd never known but whose presence was a constant, invisible guest in the cabin. With each stitch, she felt as if she were not just mending cloth, but piecing together the fractured history of this strange, broken family she now belonged to. It was a quilt of patches and remnants, a map of their lives. A new square, cut from her own worn-out apron, found its place in the corner. The first big snowstorm hit without warning, a furious blizzard that descended from the peaks and swallowed the world in a swirling vortex of white. For 3 days, they were sealed inside the cabin. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow piled in great drifts against the door and the single window. The world was reduced to the 4 walls of their shelter and the steady roar of the fire. The enforced intimacy changed things. They shared stories around the fire at night. Asa spoke of the mountains, of tracking elk and reading the signs of the weather. Eliza, hesitant at first, spoke of the books she had secretly read in Pike's study, tales of faraway places she could hardly imagine. She began teaching the children their letters, scratching the alphabet into a piece of slate with a charcoal nub. May was a quick, eager student. Jonah, as always, watched and absorbed everything, his silence a deep well of thought. On the 3rd day of the storm, Eliza was sweeping near the hearth. The floorboards in that area were old and uneven. As she swept, the head of the broom caught on the edge of a loose board, lifting it slightly. Curiosity piqued. She knelt down. It was a small section, easily pried up with her fingers. Beneath it was a hollow space, and inside that space, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, were 2 objects. The first was a small, leather-bound notebook. She opened it. The pages were filled not with words, but with strange, meticulous symbols and numbers, columns of figures and what looked like crude maps. It was a code of some kind, utterly indecipherable. The second object made her breath catch in her throat. It was a star-shaped badge, tarnished and rusted at the edges, but its form was unmistakable. It was the badge of a lawman. Her mind reeled. The quiet mountain man, the recluse, the half-crow outcast, a lawman? It made no sense. She looked over at Asa, who was mending a snowshoe by the fire, his expression calm and focused. Who was this man she was living with? What secrets was he hiding behind his silent, watchful eyes? She had to know. Later that evening, when the children were asleep, she took a steadying breath. "Asa," she began, her voice quiet. "While I was sweeping today, I found a loose board by the hearth." He stopped his work, his hands going still. He didn't look at her, but she felt the focus of his attention shift to her, sharp and absolute. "There was something underneath," she continued, her heart hammering. "A notebook and a badge." Slowly, he set down the snowshoe and turned to face her. His face was a stone mask, his eyes dark and unreadable. The warmth of the cabin seemed to recede, replaced by a sudden, chilling tension. He rose to his feet, walked to the hearth, and lifted the loose board himself. He removed the oilcloth package, his movements deliberate. He didn't open it. He simply stood there, holding it in his hand, his back to her. "Some things are best left where you find them," he said, his voice low and flat. It was not a suggestion. It was a warning. Without another word, he walked to his own gear in the corner, tucked the package deep inside his saddlebag, and returned to his seat by the fire as if nothing had happened. He picked up the snowshoe and resumed his work, leaving Eliza standing in the middle of the room. The silence between them now filled with a new and dangerous weight. The fortress had a secret cellar, and she had just stumbled upon the door. The secret of the badge lay between them like a newly fallen stone in the middle of a well-worn path. They walked around it, pretended it wasn't there, but its presence changed the landscape of their silence. Eliza's questions were a palpable thing in the air, a hum of unspoken words. Asa's warning had been clear, and she did not broach the subject again, but the knowledge altered her perception of him. Every time he left for the trap line, his rifle easy in his hands, she wondered, was he hunting more than just beaver and fox? Every time his gaze grew distant as he stared into the fire, she wondered what battles he was fighting in the landscape of his mind. Life, however, did not wait for secrets to be unspooled. It demanded work. The weeks following the great storm were a blur of industry. The cold deepened its hold on the mountains, and survival became a relentless series of tasks. Asa taught her how to set snares for snowshoe hares, his instructions economical and precise. He showed her how to read the tracks in the snow, to know the difference between a deer and a wolf, a friend and a foe. They worked together in the smokehouse, the sharp, pleasant scent of hickory clinging to their clothes as they hung strips of venison and trout to cure. Eliza learned to render deer fat into tallow for candles and soap, a greasy, time-consuming job that filled the cabin with a rich, meaty smell. In the evenings, the world shrank to the warm circle of firelight. The quilt she had started grew, piece by piece, a silent chronicle of their days. Eliza continued her lessons with the children. May learned to write her name in wavering, determined letters. Jonah, who still rarely spoke, revealed a startling aptitude for numbers. He would sit beside Eliza, his small face scrunched in concentration, arranging pebbles into groups and patterns, understanding the logic of addition and subtraction almost intuitively. Sometimes, Asa would talk, not about the badge or his past, but about the mountains. He told stories of his mother, a crow woman who had taught him which plants could heal and which could harm. He spoke of his sister, the twins' mother, describing her fierce laugh and the way she could soothe any frightened animal. In these moments, the stone wall around him would crumble, just a little, and Eliza would see the man beneath the armor, a man burdened by a grief he could not share. The truce with winter was broken by a cough. It started small, a dry little hack from Jonah in the middle of the night. By morning, it had worsened, taking on a strange, harsh, seal-like bark that echoed unnervingly in the quiet cabin. His breathing grew labored, each inhalation a high-pitched, desperate whistle. His face was flushed with fever, his small body struggling for air. Asa's composure, usually as solid as the granite cliffs outside, cracked. He touched Jonah's forehead, his hand, so steady with a rifle or a skinning knife, trembling slightly. Panic flickered in the depths of his dark eyes. "Croup!" he rasped. The word a curse. He had seen it before, in a place like this, miles from any doctor. It was a death sentence. But Eliza's mind did not go to death. It went to a memory from before the storm. Asa had needed to trade some prime beaver pelts for salt and steel traps. The journey would take him near the edge of the Crow Reservation, and he had taken Eliza and the children with him, unwilling to leave them alone. There, in a small lodge that smelled of sage and sweetgrass, they had met a woman named Mrs. Running Deer. She was old, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes holding the calm, deep wisdom of the mountains themselves. While Asa had bartered, the old woman had taken Eliza aside. She had looked at Eliza's hands, noting the calluses. "You are a worker," she'd said, "a survivor." She had shown Eliza her collection of dried herbs, explaining their uses with a quiet authority that commanded respect. "For the children's cough that barks like a fox," Mrs. Running Deer had said, holding up a bundle of pine needles and a twist of dried sage. "The steam is the medicine. Boil the pine in the water. Make the air thick with it. Have them breathe the smoke of the sage. It opens the throat." Now, as Jonah gasped for breath, those words returned to Eliza with the force of a revelation. While Asa stood frozen with fear, Eliza flew into action. "The big kettle," she commanded, her voice sharp with purpose. "Fill it with water from the stream. Build up the fire, now." Asa, jolted from his stupor, moved to obey without question. Eliza grabbed a basket and ran outside into the biting cold, plunging her arms deep into the snow to find the lower boughs of a pine tree. She snapped off handfuls of fragrant needles and raced back inside. She threw them into the steaming kettle, and soon the cabin was filled with a thick, medicinal vapor that smelled of the deep forest. "We need to make a tent," she said, her mind racing. She pulled a heavy blanket from Asa's bed. "Hold this over his bed. Trap the steam." Together, they created a small, enclosed space around Jonah. Eliza sat inside it with him, holding the struggling child in her lap, her dress quickly becoming damp from the vapor. She murmured to him, nonsensical, soothing words, wiping his hot face with a cool cloth. The barking coughs continued, each one a physical blow, but she held him firm. "The sage," she told Asa, who was watching from outside the blanket tent, his face a mask of anguish. "Mrs. Running Deer said to burn the sage." Asa retrieved the small bundle from their medicine pouch. He lit the end, and a plume of pungent, gray smoke filled the cabin. Eliza took it from him and held it carefully, letting the smoke drift up into Jonah's face. He coughed and sputtered, but then, slowly, miraculously, the terrible whistling sound in his chest began to ease. For the rest of that day and all through the long, dark night, they kept their vigil. Eliza did not leave Jonah's side. Asa kept the fire roaring and the kettle boiling, his movements silent and focused. He brought her broth, which he patiently spooned between Jonah's lips, and coffee to keep her awake. They did not speak, but a new kind of communication flowed between them, a partnership forged in the crucible of crisis. They were a team, fighting a common enemy. Sometime in the gray hours before dawn, Jonah's fever broke. His breathing, though still ragged, had lost its desperate, whistling edge. He fell into a deep, natural sleep, his small hand clutching a fold of Eliza's dress. Exhaustion hit Eliza like a physical blow. She sagged against the wall, her entire body aching. Asa gently took the sleeping boy from her arms and laid him back in his bed. He then came back to her and stood for a moment, looking down at her. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, but she could see the raw gratitude in his eyes. "You saved him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know what to do. Hey, Mrs. Running Deer knew," Eliza whispered, too tired to say more. He reached down, and, for the first time, he touched her with deliberate tenderness, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Thank you, Eliza," he said. In those 3 words, the entire dynamic between them shifted. The silver coins from the trading post seemed to dissolve into dust. She was no longer the girl who had been bought. She was the woman who had saved his son. Trust, fragile and precious, had taken root in the ashes of their fear. In the days of Jonah's recovery, a new ease settled in the cabin. The secret of the badge was still there, but it no longer felt like a threat. It was simply a part of the man she was beginning to know, a man who loved his family with a fierce, quiet intensity. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch mending a shirt, she looked up at the sheer rock face that sheltered their meadow. High above, tucked into an inaccessible ledge, was an eagle's nest. She often watched the 2 eagles soaring on the thermal currents, their wild cries echoing across the valley. They were magnificent, untamed, and utterly devoted to the safety of their nest. She felt a kinship with them. This cabin, this small family, was her nest, a fragile shelter she would defend with a fierceness she hadn't known she possessed. The outside world intruded on a Tuesday. The sound was alien in their quiet valley, the unmistakable plod of shod horses. Asa was instantly alert. He moved to the door, grabbing his Winchester from the rack, and motioned for Eliza to get the children into the back of the cabin, out of sight. 2 riders emerged from the tree line. One was a ranch hand she didn't recognize, his face mean and pinched. The other was Sheriff Caleb Rusk, looking out of place in his clean, pressed town clothes. He sat his horse with an air of arrogant authority, his silver badge gleaming on his chest. Asa stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side, a casual pose that was more menacing than any overt threat. "Crow," Rusk called out, his voice oily. "Just making a friendly wellness check. Folks in town are concerned." "We're fine," Asa said, his voice flat and cold. "Are you—" Rusk dismounted, leaving his man with the horses. He swaggered toward the cabin, his eyes sweeping over everything, his gaze lingering on the child-sized laundry drying on a line. "Heard you took in a girl, Enoch Pike's ward. Rumor is you're keeping her up here, all alone. A man like you, and a young, untouched thing like that. It ain't proper." The insinuation was as foul as a festering wound. Asa's knuckles whitened on the stock of the rifle. "My household is my business, Sheriff." "Not when it offends public decency," Rusk sneered. "The good people of Pine Gulch, represented by men like Mr. Maddox and Deacon Pike, they don't hold with such arrangements. I'm here to inspect the situation, make sure the girl is safe." He took a step toward the door. Before Asa could move, the cabin door opened and Eliza stepped out. She had been listening from inside, and the sheriff's words had ignited a cold fire in her belly. She would not be discussed like a piece of livestock, not anymore. She stood beside Asa, her chin held high. She was not the frightened, silent girl from the trading post. She was a woman who had faced down death in this very cabin and won. "I am perfectly safe, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority that made Rusk blink. "This is my home now." Rusk's eyes widened slightly, taking in her appearance. She was no longer pale and thin. The mountain air and hard work had put color in her cheeks and muscle on her frame. There was a confidence in her stance he hadn't expected. "I chose to be here," Eliza continued, her gaze unwavering. "And I choose to stay. Your concern is not welcome." For a moment, Rusk was speechless. He had come expecting a frightened girl he could intimidate, a situation he could use as leverage against the troublesome mountain man. Instead, he found a united front. He looked from Eliza's defiant face to Asa's dangerously calm one. He saw the rifle. He forced a laugh, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Well, if you say so, but don't come crying to me when this mountain savage shows his true colors." He turned and walked back to his horse, his swagger a little less pronounced. He mounted up and glared back at them one last time. "We'll be watching. Crow!" He spat. "Maddox has a long memory." Then he and his man turned their horses and rode away, their presence dissolving back into the vast wilderness, leaving only a trail of trampled snow and a lingering poison in the air. Eliza and Asa stood on the porch, watching them go. The immediate threat had passed, but they both knew this was only the beginning. The world of Pine Gulch, with its greed and its judgment, would not let them be. Eliza looked up at the cliff face. The two eagles were circling their nest, their sharp cries a warning to all intruders. Their home was secure for now, but the wind was picking up, and the storms of men were gathering on the horizon. Sheriff Rusk's visit left a chill that the roaring fire could not quite dispel. The invisible walls of their mountain sanctuary had been breached, and the outside world, with all its malice and judgment, now knew the path to their door. A quiet tension settled over the cabin as winter began its slow, grudging retreat. The snowpack melted, the stream swelled to a muddy torrent, and the first green shoots of spring pushed through the sodden earth. Life was returning to the mountains, but with it came the need to reconnect with the world below. Their supplies of salt, flour, and coffee were dwindling, and they needed seeds if they were to have a garden. The trip to Pine Gulch was a necessity they could no longer postpone, for the first time since she had arrived. Eliza rode beside Asa on the sled, the children bundled between them. She wore a dress she had fashioned from a bolt of sturdy brown wool Asa had traded for, and her hair was neatly braided. She was not the same person who had left this town. She sat taller, her gaze direct, her hands resting calmly in her lap. But as the familiar, dusty outlines of the town came into view, the old anxieties stirred within her like agitated snakes. Pine Gulch had not changed. The same listless men loitered on the boardwalks, their gazes following the strange mountain family with a mixture of suspicion and lewd curiosity. Whispers followed them like a cloud of gnats. Eliza felt the heat of their stares and forced herself to meet them, refusing to be cowed. Their first stop was the Mercantile, now run by a new man since Pike had devoted himself more fully to his deaconship and other, less public, business. As Asa loaded their supplies, Eliza took the children to get a piece of horehound candy. It was there she first met Tess Rollins. Tess ran the town's only boarding house and saloon, a place that served as the unofficial center of Pine Gulch society. She was a woman in her 40s, with shrewd, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense air that kept even the rowdiest cowboys in line. She was standing outside her establishment, watching the street, when Eliza walked by. Their eyes met. Tess's gaze was appraising, not judgmental. She took in Eliza's healthy appearance, the well-cared-for children, and the quiet dignity in her bearing. "You're the Crow woman," Tess stated, her voice surprisingly warm. "I'm Eliza Wynne," she replied, her own voice steady. Tess smiled, a small, genuine thing. "Good for you." It was all she said, but in that brief exchange, a silent understanding passed between them. Eliza had found an unlikely and unspoken ally. As they were preparing to leave, the sound of a gavel banging drew their attention to the small building that served as the town hall and courthouse. A crowd was gathered, spilling out the front door. A land rights hearing was underway. Asa paused, his body going tense. "We should go," he said, his voice low. But it was too late. From the courthouse steps, Sheriff Rusk spotted them, A slow, malevolent grin spread across his face. Well, look who's come down from the mountain. Crow, the judge is in session. Might be a good time to settle some civic matters. Before Asa could refuse, Rusk had crossed the street, his presence an official command. Trapped. Asa led Eliza and the children into the crowded, stuffy room. At the front, on a raised platform, sat Judge Harlan Bixby. He was an old man, with a face like a weathered map, and eyes that seemed to have seen every folly and cruelty mankind was capable of. He presided over the hearing with a weary patience, his gaze missing nothing. They stood at the back, trying to remain inconspicuous. The case involved a small homesteader whose water rights were being challenged by one of Luther Maddox's foremen. Maddox himself sat in the front row, a smug, proprietary air about him, as if the law were merely another one of his possessions. To his surprise, and the room's, Judge Bixby ruled in favor of the homesteader, citing a little-known territorial statute. "The law, Mr. Maddox," the judge said, his voice a dry rasp, "is intended to be a fence that protects the flock, not a leash for the wealthy to drag the poor." Maddox's face tightened with fury. It was at that moment, with the tension in the room at its peak, that Enoch Pike chose to make his move. He stood up, his face a mask of pious concern. "Your Honor," he began, his voice ringing with false humility, "while this esteemed court is in session, I feel it is my Christian duty to bring a matter of grave moral importance to your attention." Every eye in the room turned to him. Judge Bixby sighed, a long, suffering sound. "What is it, Deacon Pike?" Pike pointed a trembling finger to the back of the room, directly at Eliza. "It concerns my former ward, Eliza Wynne, an innocent, orphaned girl who has been living in an improper state with that man." His voice rose with theatrical indignation. "A reclusive half-breed, a man of no standing, no known occupation, he has spirited her away to his mountain den. Far from the civilizing grace of our community, I fear for her safety. Your Honor, I fear for her very soul." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Eliza felt her blood run cold. She was on trial again, in the court of public opinion, with Pike as the prosecutor. "I formally petition this court," Pike declared, "to have the girl removed from that lawless environment and returned to my legal and spiritual protection until a proper Christian marriage can be arranged." Asa stepped in front of Eliza, shielding her from the prying eyes. His hand rested on the hilt of the long knife at his belt, his body a silent promise of violence. Judge Bixby banged his gavel. "Order, Deacon. This is a land court, not a moral tribunal." "However," he said, stroking his chin, his sharp eyes moving from Pike to Asa and then to Eliza, "your petition, being a matter of public concern regarding a ward of this territory, has been noted." He looked directly at Asa. "The law must be satisfied that the young woman is of sound mind and is not being held against her will. I, along with the sheriff, will ride up to your homestead tomorrow at noon to conduct a formal inquiry." It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Bixby had delayed Pike's mob justice and inserted himself as the arbiter. Rusk looked furious. Pike looked momentarily thwarted. "This court is adjourned," Bixby declared, banging the gavel one last time. The ride back to the mountain was a grim, silent affair. They arrived to find that their enemies had not waited. A posse of a dozen men, led by Pike and Rusk, was already in their meadow. A few were Maddox's hired guns, their face hard and cruel. Others were self-righteous townsmen, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of a righteous crusade. Tess Rollins was there too, standing off to the side with a few of the more independent-minded townsfolk, her arms crossed, her expression one of deep disapproval. They had clearly followed, unwilling to let the law proceed at its own pace. "Crow!" Rusk shouted as Asa pulled the sled to a halt. "We're here on behalf of the Pine Gulch Committee of Vigilance. We're taking the girl back." Asa lifted the children from the sled and pushed them toward the cabin door. "Eliza, get them inside. Bolt the door." He then turned to face the mob, planting himself squarely in front of his home. He held no rifle, but his presence was more formidable than a line of armed men. "You are not welcome here," he said, his voice dangerously low. "There is no committee here. There is only my home. Leave." Pike stepped forward, holding a Bible like a weapon. "We are here to save this fallen woman from a life of sin. Eliza, come out, renounce this savage, and return to the fold." The cabin door opened, but Eliza did not come out cowering. She walked out and stood beside Asa, facing the mob, her fear burned away by a cold, hard anger. "This is my home," she said, her voice carrying across the meadow, clear and strong. The men shifted, surprised by her defiance. Deacon Pike was my jailer, not my guardian. For the first time in my life, I am treated with respect. I have a family. She looked directly at Pike, her eyes flashing. "I choose to be here." "The girl speaks for herself. Pike," Tess Rollins called out from the side. "Looks to me like she's made her choice. Leave them be." A couple of homesteaders, the same ones who had won their case against Maddox earlier, nodded in agreement, murmuring their assent. The mob's conviction wavered. Infuriated, Rusk shoved his way to the front. "I don't care what she says. She's coming with us." He lunged forward, intending to grab Eliza. Asa moved like lightning. Stepping between them, he caught Rusk's arm in a grip of iron. Rusk, enraged, tried to wrestle free, shoving Asa hard. The force of the blow knocked Asa's heavy buckskin coat open. For a single, fleeting second, a piece of metal pinned to the inside of Asa's shirt glinted in the noon sun. It was a tarnished, five-pointed star, a Deputy U.S. Marshal's badge. Most of the mob, caught up in the drama, missed it. Rusk was too close, too consumed by his own rage. Pike was blinded by his self-righteousness. But a few yards away, just dismounting from his horse, Judge Harlan Bixby saw it. His old eyes, missing nothing, widened for a fraction of a second. He looked from the badge to Asa's face. Their eyes locked. A lifetime of calculation and understanding passed between them in that instant. The judge gave a nearly imperceptible nod, so slight that only Asa could have caught it. "That is enough!" Sheriff Bixby's voice boomed across the meadow, cracking with the authority of the law. The scuffle ceased. All eyes turned to the judge. He strode into the center of the confrontation, his presence immediately commanding order. "I am here to conduct my inquiry. As I said I would, I have heard the young woman's testimony. She is an adult, of sound mind, and has declared her free will. Under territorial law, she is free to reside wherever she chooses." He glared at Pike and Rusk. "This committee is an unlawful assembly. Disperse at once, or I will have you all brought up on charges of disturbing the peace and menacing." Faced with a direct order from a territorial judge, the mob's courage evaporated. Grumbling, they began to break apart, turning their horses and heading back down the mountain path. Their crusade a failure. Pike and Rusk were the last to leave, their faces black with impotent fury. In the aftermath, a new story took root in Pine Gulch. Someone claimed they had seen something shiny on Crow's chest during the fight, a tin star. Maybe the story was twisted and embellished until a new legend was born. Asa Crow wasn't just some mountain hermit. The reason he was so skilled, so dangerous, the reason even Judge Bixby seemed to respect him, was because he was a bounty hunter, a man-killer, living in the mountains to stay hidden between jobs. The rumor served a dual purpose. It explained away the unexplainable, and it kept most people from ever wanting to bother him again. The news eventually reached Luther Maddox. He sat in his leather chair, swirling a glass of whiskey, a thoughtful, dangerous look on his face. The brute force approach had failed. The legal approach had failed. This new information, however, was interesting. A bounty hunter. A man with a particular set of skills. Maddox preferred to own powerful things, not fight them. A man like that could be a tool, if the price was right. Or, if he refused, a threat that had to be eliminated with cunning and precision, not with a clumsy mob. He smiled slowly. The game had just become much more interesting. He would no longer try to knock down Crow's door. He would set a trap, baited with something Crow couldn't possibly refuse, and let the mountain man walk right into it. The aftermath of the confrontation left a strange sort of peace in its wake. The rumor of Asa being a bounty hunter, though false, served as a formidable scarecrow, keeping the townsfolk and their misguided righteousness at a distance. For the first time, Eliza felt they were truly left alone. The meadow and the cabin an island in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Spring arrived in earnest, a quiet, steady miracle of melting snow and returning life. The days grew longer, warmer, and a sense of fragile hope began to permeate the air. But the confrontation had also unearthed something between them. His secret, glimpsed in a flash of tarnished metal, and her public, defiant choice to stand with him had created a new, unspoken intimacy. The space between them, once filled with the silence of strangers, was now charged with the silence of allies who had faced a common enemy and held their ground. They had become a unit, a fortress of four, and the knowledge of it had changed them both. One evening, after a long day of clearing ground for a garden, a profound stillness settled over the mountain. The children were asleep, their breathing soft and even in the quiet cabin. A full moon, pale and luminous, rose over the granite peaks, bathing the meadow in a soft, ethereal light. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. From the stream, a gentle mist rose, the steam from the hot spring curling into the night like a ghostly breath. Asa stood on the porch, staring out into the moonlit darkness. Eliza came to stand beside him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. They stood for a long time without speaking, sharing the immense, peaceful quiet of the night. "They have her eyes," Asa said, his voice a low rumble, so quiet she almost missed it. "May and Jonah, they have my sister's eyes." Eliza waited. She had learned that his words, when they came, were like stones pulled from a deep well. They took time and effort to surface. "Her name was Sarah," he continued, his gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point in the past. "She was fierce and kind. She married a good man, a homesteader named Thomas. They built a life down on the Powder River. They weren't hurting anyone, just wanted a piece of land to call their own, to raise their family." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with a sorrow so deep it felt like a physical weight. Eliza could feel the tremor of it in the man standing beside her. Maddox wanted their land. It had the best water access for miles. He tried to buy them out, but Thomas wouldn't sell. So Maddox sent his men not to talk. They came in the night. His voice grew thick, ragged with a pain he had clearly carried alone for too long. "They said it was Indians. That was the story they told. But I know who it was. I found the tracks. I found the brand they used. A cattle brand. Burned into the door of the cabin before they set it alight." He finally turned to look at her, and in the moonlight, she saw the raw, unshielded anguish in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had failed in the one duty that mattered most. "I was supposed to be there. I was hunting, a few days' ride away. She'd asked me to come, said she was nervous, that men had been seen watching their place. But I was late." A single, difficult breath shuddered through him. "By the time I got there, it was all gone, just smoke and ash. I found the children hiding in a root cellar. They were the only ones who made it out. They saw it all." The truth landed with devastating force. The twins were not just his wards. They were the living remnants of his greatest failure, the reason for his exile, the focus of his all-consuming, silent vow to protect, the badge, the secrets. It all began to click into a terrible, coherent shape. "That is not a burden you should carry alone, Asa," Eliza said softly. The simple words of empathy seemed to break something in him. He looked away, toward the rising steam of the spring. "I brought them here to keep them safe, to hide them, but I brought the world's trouble right to our door when I brought you here." "You brought me here," Eliza said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she had. "And for the first time in my life, I have a home. You talk of debt, of failure. Let me tell you of my life, Asa." She moved to sit on the top step of the porch, the moonlight catching in her hair. "I don't remember my parents. My first memory is of being told I was a burden, an extra mouth to feed. I was passed from one relative to another, my worth measured only by the work my hands could do. When I was 10, I was given to Enoch Pike. He called me his ward. He told the town he was my savior, a good Christian man taking in an orphan. But I was his property. He clothed me in rags and fed me scraps, and in return, I worked from sunup to sundown. He used God as a shield for his greed." She looked at her own hands, calloused and strong. "My whole life, I have been a transaction, a contract, a thing to be given, or sold, or traded, that day in the mercantile. It was just the final sale. I was nothing more than a horse or a sack of flour." She looked up at him, her gaze clear and unwavering. "Until I came here, you have never laid a hand on me in anger. You have never demanded anything of me that I did not choose to give. You gave me a rifle and taught me to protect myself. You listened when I spoke. You gave me a voice." The steam from the spring beckoned, a silent invitation. "Come," she said, rising. "The water is warm. Let it wash the trail dust off." He followed her, his steps heavy. They went to the wide, shallow pool where the hot spring water collected before it tumbled down into the stream. Billows of white steam rose from the surface, obscuring the world, creating a private, sacred space for just the two of them. They shed their outer layers, leaving them on the bank, and waded into the soothing, mineral-rich water. The warmth was a balm, seeping into tired muscles and weary souls. They sat on a smooth rock ledge, the water up to their chests, the steam swirling around them like a curtain. For a long time, they were silent, letting the warmth and the quiet do their work. "I cannot offer you a name the world respects," Asa said finally, his voice soft in the misty air. "Or a life without hardship. The bounty hunter rumor keeps men away for now, but Maddox will not forget. The danger is not gone." "I am not afraid of hardship," Eliza replied. "I am afraid of being powerless, of being a ghost in my own life." He turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face in the shifting steam. "Then I will make you a vow, not before a preacher or a judge, but here, before this mountain that has seen all my sorrows." He took her hand, his large, calloused palm enveloping hers. "You are my partner in this home, Eliza Wynne. Your voice is equal to mine. Your safety, and the safety of the children, will be the work of my life. No one will ever own you again, I swear it." Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back welled in her eyes. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, heartbreaking relief. "And I will make you a vow, Asa Crow," she answered, her voice thick but steady. "You will not have to carry your burdens alone. We will carry them together. This will be my home, and they will be my children. I choose it, I swear it." It was a marriage of two broken souls, a union forged not of law or convenience, but of shared pain and a fierce, mutual respect. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of such reverence it made her chest ache. In that moment, the last barrier between them dissolved. He was not the silent mountain man, and she was not the girl he had bought. They were simply a man and a woman who had found in each other a sanctuary from the cruelty of the world. He raised his other hand and cupped her face, his thumb gently brushing away a tear. His touch was not one of passion, but of deep, quiet confirmation. It was a healing touch, a question and an answer all in one. She leaned into his hand, a silent surrender not of her will, but of her fear. She had spent a lifetime building walls to protect a self that no one had ever valued. Here, in this swirling steam, with this man who had vowed her an equal, she finally felt safe enough to let them fall. When he lowered his head to kiss her, it was as natural and as necessary as breathing. It was a kiss that held no demands, only a quiet, profound tenderness. It spoke of shared solitude, of winter storms weathered together, of a child's fever broken in the dead of night. It was the sealing of their vow, a silent promise kept. The steam coiled around them, a soft white blanket, granting them privacy and peace. What passed between them in the warm, dark water was a quiet mending, a gentle piecing together of two lives into one. It was a confirmation of the family they had already become, an act of trust so complete it washed away the last lingering stains of the past, the dirty silver, the sanctimonious pronouncements, the lonely, painful years. It was a moment of profound and quiet healing, a rebirth in the heart of the wilderness. Later, they sat on the bank, wrapped in blankets, the fire in the cabin a welcoming glow in the distance. The moon was high now, the world asleep. Asa put his arm around her, and she leaned against his solid strength, a feeling of rightness settling deep in her bones. The path ahead was still uncertain, fraught with the dangers of men like Maddox. But for the first time, she did not feel alone on that path. They were a family, forged not by law or by blood, but by a vow made in steam and shadow. They would face whatever came, together. The vow made in the rising steam of the hot spring was a foundation, and upon it, Asa and Eliza began to build a new life. The silence between them was no longer a space to be cautiously navigated, but a shared territory of comfort and understanding. One evening, as the children slept and the fire crackled low, Asa finally retrieved the oilcloth package from his saddlebag. He placed the tarnished badge and the coded notebook on the table between them. "This is the truth of it, Eliza," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "The whole truth." He was a deputy United States Marshal. For 2 years, he had been working undercover, assigned to the Wyoming Territory to investigate rumors of a massive land-grabbing scheme run by a man who was buying up lawmen and terrorizing homesteaders. That man was Luther Maddox. Asa had used his mother's Crow heritage and his mountain skills as a cover, building a persona of a reclusive outcast that would allow him to observe Pine Gulch without drawing the kind of attention a federal officer would. "My sister, Sarah, her murder wasn't random," Asa explained, his fingers tracing the star shape of the badge. "It was the beginning of my investigation. I was supposed to be gathering intelligence, but it became personal. The children are the only living witnesses to what Maddox's men did that night. Keeping them hidden, keeping them safe, is everything. The notebook is where I've kept the proof." He opened the small book, and for the first time, Eliza understood. The strange symbols were a shorthand he'd invented, a mix of Crow pictographs and surveyor's marks. He showed her how they corresponded to dates, names, and numbers. Together, they deciphered the columns of figures that represented phantom cattle herds, livestock that existed only on paper. Their inflated numbers used by Maddox to claim vast swaths of grazing land under territorial law, squeezing out the smaller ranchers. Eliza, with her clear hand and quicker grasp of letters and figures, became his partner in the truest sense. She was no longer just protecting his home. She was helping him build his case. She spent hours copying his rough notes onto clean sheets of paper, organizing the chaotic collection of facts into a coherent narrative of crime and corruption. Her mind, so long starved of any real challenge, proved to be sharp and methodical. She saw patterns Asa had missed, connections between names and dates that strengthened the web of evidence. Their investigation became a silent, secret war waged from their mountain fortress. Asa made careful, infrequent trips, sometimes disappearing for 2 days at a time. He would return with a new piece of the puzzle, a surreptitiously copied page from a shipping manifest at the railhead, showing Maddox was selling far fewer cattle than his ledgers claimed, a territorial map from Cheyenne, which, when overlaid with Asa's own sketches, proved Maddox was seizing land directly in the path of the railroad's secret, planned expansion. The most damning piece of evidence came from the territorial brand registry. Asa returned one evening, his face grim. He sketched a symbol on a piece of slate, a simple circle with a cruel, jagged line through the middle. "This is Maddox's official brand," he said. Then he sketched another beside it, adding 2 small horns to the circle. "This is the brand his enforcers use for their dirty work. It's unregistered, unofficial." He looked at Eliza, his eyes dark with the memory. It's the brand that was burned into Sarah's door. As their shared purpose deepened, so did their life together. The passing of the seasons brought another, more personal change. In the late spring, Eliza realized the familiar rhythms of her own body had fallen silent. A quiet, fluttering hope, mingled with a new and potent fear, took root within her. The life they had forged was already so precarious, bringing a new one into it felt like an act of radical, terrifying faith. They went to see Mrs. Running Deer. The old Crow woman listened to Eliza's whispered fears, her wise eyes full of a gentle understanding. She placed a soft, wrinkled hand on Eliza's still flat stomach and smiled. "The eagle builds its nest on the highest cliff, not because the spot is safe, but because it is strong," she said. "A child is a sign that life is stronger than the storm. We will help you." From then on, their visits became more frequent. Mrs. Running Deer and the other women of her small community took Eliza under their wing, teaching her which teas would soothe her morning sickness and which herbs would strengthen her body. They embraced May and Jonah, teaching them the Crow words for the sun and the moon, showing them how to find edible roots and healing plants, and telling them stories of their mother's people. The children, who had been raised in the shadow of loss, began to bloom. Their heritage no longer a source of shame or secrecy, but a wellspring of pride and belonging. Their family was growing, its roots spreading deeper into the ancient, knowing soil of the mountains. But the brighter their light shone in the cabin, the darker the shadow of Pine Gulch loomed below. Maddox was not a man to be thwarted. Frustrated by his inability to intimidate Asa, he changed his tactics. He decided to attack the heart of their fortress, Eliza. It happened on a trip to town for supplies they couldn't make or trade for with the Crow. They were just leaving the mercantile when Sheriff Rusk and 2 of his deputies blocked their path. "Eliza win," Rusk said, his voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. "You are under arrest." Asa immediately moved in front of her, the children scrambling behind his legs. "On what charge?" Asa's voice was lethally calm. "Lewd and lascivious cohabitation," Rusk declared loudly. "For the benefit of the gathering crowd, this territory has laws against living in sin, and it's my job to enforce them. You're an affront to the decent, God-fearing people of this town." It was a trap, and they had walked right into it. The charge was flimsy, but it was designed to publicly shame Eliza and legally separate her from Asa. Humiliation washed over Eliza, hot and sickening, but she clenched her fists and stood her ground. "You have no right," Asa said, his eyes like chips of flint. "I have a warrant, signed by Deacon Pike as a concerned citizen," Rusk said, flourishing a piece of paper. "Now, she can come peacefully, or we can do this the hard way." He was baiting Asa, trying to provoke him into a fight that would land him in jail or in a grave, leaving Eliza and the children vulnerable. Asa knew it. The rage that coiled in his gut was a living thing, but he wrestled it down. He could not blow his cover. Not now. He met Eliza's eyes over the heads of the children. A silent message passed between them. "Trust me." He nodded slowly. "There's no need for that. Sheriff, the lady will comply with your request." He turned to Eliza, his voice softening. "It will be all right." As Rusk's men took her arms, Eliza looked back at Asa, standing alone in the dusty street with the two frightened children clinging to him. For a moment, her resolve wavered, but then she saw the cold, calculated fury in his eyes and knew this was not a surrender. It was a strategic retreat. Asa took May and Jonah directly to Tess Rollins' boarding house. Tess took one look at the children's terrified faces and Asa's thunderous expression and ushered them inside without a word, asking no questions. "They'll be safe here," was all she said. From there, Asa went straight to Judge Bixby's chambers. He found the old judge reading a law book, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. "They've arrested Eliza," Asa said without preamble. Bixby looked up over his spectacles. "I expected as much. Pike and Maddox are fools, but they're predictable fools. The charge is a nuisance, but it will take days to dismiss through the proper channels. They mean to hold her." "I don't have days," Asa said. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded, oil-stained dispatch, its seal bearing the mark of the U.S. Department of Justice. "This is a federal warrant. Your Honor, it gives me the authority to investigate crimes related to interstate commerce and conspiracy to defraud the government. Luther Maddox is my target." Bixby took the letter and read it slowly. A long, low whistle escaped his lips. So, the rumor wasn't entirely wrong. "You are a hunter, just not the kind they thought." He looked at Asa with newfound respect. "This changes things. But if we reveal you now, your investigation is over, and Maddox might just slip the noose." "I will not leave Eliza in a cell," Asa stated, his voice flat and final. "And you won't have to," the judge said, a cunning glint in his old eyes. "Maddox and Rusk are using territorial law as their weapon. We shall use it as our shield." He convened an emergency hearing in his chambers. Rusk, smug and self-assured, presented his warrant and his case. When he was finished, Judge Bixby cleared his throat. "Sheriff, according to Territorial Statute 113 Section B, a man who is the legal and established guardian of minor children is also granted the title of head of household." He began, his voice dry as dust. "All persons residing within that household for the purpose of maintaining said household, including domestic staff, tutors, or, in this case, a woman acting as a surrogate mother to the wards fall under the legal protection of that guardianship." He picked up a pen and began to write. "It is a legal gray area, to be sure, but I find that the stability of the children's home outweighs the moral concerns of Deacon Pike. I am therefore issuing a temporary writ of household guardianship, placing Miss Wynne under the court's protection and ordering her immediate release into the custody of Mr. Crow." Rusk's jaw dropped. He had been outmaneuvered, beaten with a law so obscure he'd never even heard of it. "Your Honor, this is my ruling. Sheriff," Bixby cut him off. "She is to be released. Now." The reunion was quiet, emotional. Asa met her at the jailhouse door, and they held each other for a long moment, the fear and fury of the day slowly receding. But they both knew this was only a temporary reprieve. They had won the battle. But Maddox would only escalate the war. They were right. 2 days later, a lone rider approached their cabin, a dirty white cloth tied to his saddle horn. It was one of Maddox's men. He kept his distance, his face a mixture of fear and bravado. "Got a message for Crow," he yelled, "from Mr. Maddox." Asa stepped onto the porch. "I'm Crow." "Mr. Maddox is a reasonable man," the rider recited, his words clearly rehearsed. "He says there's been enough trouble. He wants to talk. Proposes a meeting to settle things, man to man, Iron Canyon, day after tomorrow. At sunset, he says to come alone." Eliza came to stand beside Asa, her hand resting on the new swell of her belly. They both knew what the message meant. There would be no talk, no settlement. Iron Canyon was a known ambush spot, a maze of rocks and gullies with no easy way out. It was not an invitation to a parley. It was an invitation to a killing ground. Asa looked from the rider to the rugged peaks that loomed behind their cabin. He looked at Eliza, at the fierce, unwavering strength in her eyes. He thought of the new life she carried. The time for hunting in the shadows was over. It was time to face the wolf at the door. He raised his voice, his words carrying clearly across the meadow. "Tell Maddox I'll be there." The 2 days before the meeting at Iron Canyon were a period of intense, focused calm. There was no panic, no tearful farewell. Instead, a quiet, unshakable resolve settled over the cabin, binding the 4 of them, soon to be 5, into a single, determined unit. They moved with a shared purpose, every action geared toward the coming storm. Eliza packed a small bundle of food, medicine, and the children's spare clothes, placing it by the door. Asa spent hours meticulously cleaning his rifle and pistols, the metallic clicks echoing in the otherwise silent cabin. He did not ride toward Iron Canyon at dawn. Instead, he rode east, toward the rising sun, keeping to the hidden game trails his mother had taught him. His first stop was a prearranged meeting point, a small, sheltered copse of aspens a few miles from town. Judge Bixby and Tess Rollins were waiting for him, their faces etched with worry in the pale morning light. "They'll be expecting you to ride straight into their trap," the judge said, his voice a low grumble. "I know," Asa replied. He pulled a heavy, oilcloth-wrapped package from his saddlebag. It contained Eliza's neatly copied pages, the ghost cattle ledgers, the damning brand registry, the maps, and his own sworn affidavit detailing everything, including the murder of his sister. He handed it to the judge. "This is the case against him. Every bit of it." Bixby took the package with a gravity that befitted its importance. "This will be enough to issue a federal warrant for his arrest, but it will take time to get the marshals from Cheyenne. Time you may not have." "That's where she comes in," Asa said. Turning to Tess, he handed her a smaller, thinner envelope. "This is a summary. Names, dates, crimes. There's a reporter for the Cheyenne Leader staying at your boarding house. I've seen him. He's investigating the railroad's land deals. Get this to him. Tell him the story of the century is about to break in Pine Gulch. Win or lose. Maddox's empire starts to crumble today. The truth has to get out." Tess tucked the envelope into her coat, her expression grim but resolute. "I'll see to it personally. Godspeed." "Asa." "Maddox won't go to Iron Canyon either," Asa said to the judge. "He's not a wolf who hunts alone. He's a rabid dog who uses a pack, while his men wait in the canyon. He'll take his committee and go to the one place he knows I'll die to protect. He's going to my home." The judge nodded, his old eyes hard. "I'll gather who I can trust and follow. But Asa, he'll have the numbers." "I'm counting on it," Asa said. He swung back onto his horse. "Hold him there until I arrive. That's all I ask." With a final, curt nod, he melted back into the trees, circling wide, a hunter turning the tables on his prey. Back at the cabin, the wind began to pick up. It was a strange wind, hot and dry, rattling the window panes and moaning under the eaves. It rustled the prairie grass, now cured to a hay-like tinder by the late summer sun, making it whisper and hiss. Eliza stood at the window, watching the horizon. May and Jonah were quiet, sensing the tension. She had given Jonah a small, carved wooden whistle. "If you ever get scared, or if you need to call for help, you blow on this as hard as you can." Asa had told him just that morning. "The eagles will hear you, and so will our friends." They came just as the sun began to touch the western peaks, casting long, menacing shadows across the meadow. It was not an army, but a mob, their forms dark against the blood-red sunset. Luther Maddox rode at their head, flanked by Sheriff Rusk. Behind them were 24 men hired guns. resentful townsmen, and the sanctimonious Deacon Pike, his face flushed with a righteous fury. They carried torches and ropes. "Get in the cellar," Eliza told the children, her voice calm and even. "Stay away from the door, and do not make a sound until I come for you." They obeyed without a whimper. Eliza took the Winchester, checked the load, and stood beside the heavy, bolted door. Crow Maddox's voice boomed across the meadow, arrogant and triumphant. "We know you're in there. Your time is over. We've come to cleanse this mountain of your filth." "He's not here," Maddox Eliza shouted back, her voice carrying on the rising wind. "He's gone to meet you, just like you asked." A cruel laugh answered her. "Did you really think I was that stupid? He's in a canyon full of my riflemen right now. By the time they're done with him, the coyotes won't find enough to chew on. Now, send out the girl and the whelps. The Committee of Vigilance is here to pass judgment." The wind howled, whipping the flames of their torches into a frenzy. A spark, torn loose from a torch, landed in the dry grass. It smoldered for a second, then erupted. A line of orange fire began to crawl, then race across the meadow, driven by the relentless wind. Just as the mob surged forward, a new party of riders appeared, cresting the hill behind them. It was Judge Bixby, along with Tess Rollins and a handful of the homesteaders who had stood with them before. They were outnumbered, but they placed themselves between the mob and the cabin. "In the name of the law of the Wyoming Territory, I order you to disperse." Bixby's voice, though old, cracked with absolute authority. Rusk laughed. "Your law has no meaning here. Old man, this is the people's law." "Then perhaps you will recognize a higher authority," Bixby retorted. He reached into his coat and produced a heavy document, its federal seal gleaming in the firelight. The wind tore at it, but he held it fast. "Luther Maddox Caleb Rusk Enoch Pike, by the authority vested in me by the United States Department of Justice. I am here to serve a federal warrant." He paused, letting the words sink in. The mob faltered, confused. "This is nonsense," Maddox snarled. "Is it?" Bixby's voice sliced through the wind. "For 2 years, this territory has been under federal investigation, and the man you sent to his death in Iron Canyon is the lead investigator." He took a deep, theatrical breath, his voice rising to a crescendo that shocked the entire valley. His secret shocked all. For Asa Crow is a commissioned deputy United States Marshal. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The homesteaders stared in disbelief, then dawning respect. Maddox's men looked at each other, their certainty beginning to crumble. Pike's face went slack, the color draining from it. "He's been investigating a conspiracy to defraud the government and seize land. A conspiracy that led to the murder of his sister, Sarah Crow, and her husband," Bixby continued, his gaze locking onto Maddox. "And those 2 children inside that cabin are the only living witnesses to that crime. They saw the men who lit the fire. They saw the brand on the door." He then turned his fiery gaze on Pike. "And you, Deacon, are named in this warrant as a co-conspirator, complicit in a ring of human trafficking, selling orphans and wards into servitude under the guise of Christian charity." The revelation was a lightning strike, shattering the mob's reality. In that moment of stunned silence, a figure emerged from the trees at the edge of the meadow, moving with a calm, deadly grace. It was Asa. The fire, forgotten for a moment, was now a roaring wall of flame, cutting off the mob's retreat. Panic began to set in. The crowd divided, the homesteaders instinctively moving toward the cabin, away from Maddox's thugs. "The fire, it'll take the cabin," Tess screamed. Eliza threw open the door. "Tess, the women, the stream. We need a fire break." Instantly, a new battle began. While the men were frozen in their standoff, Eliza, Tess, and the homesteaders' wives ran to the stream with buckets, blankets, anything they could find, soaking them and beating at the edges of the flames, creating a desperate, smoldering line of defense to protect the home and the children within. Asa did not go for Maddox. He walked calmly through the chaos toward the symbol of corrupted law. He reached Sheriff Rusk in 3 long strides, seized his pistol, and threw it into the fire. Before Rusk could react, Asa slammed a pair of iron cuffs onto his wrists. "Sheriff Rusk, you're under arrest." Finally, Asa turned to face his sister's murderer. Maddox, his face a mask of cornered fury, drew his own pistol, but he was too late. Seeing his power broken, his men deserting him, he did the only thing a coward could do. He lunged for the cabin door, grabbing Eliza as she turned from the fire line, and pulled her in front of him as a human shield. He pressed the cold muzzle of his gun to her temple. "Stay back, Marshal!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Or the girl and your bastard get it first." From inside the cellar, Jonah saw it all through a crack in the door. He saw the gun at his aunt's head. He saw his uncle, frozen. He remembered his uncle's words. He lifted the small wooden whistle to his lips and blew with all the air in his small lungs. A high, piercing, desperate note cut through the roar of the wind and the fire. The sound was answered almost immediately. From the woods on the far side of the meadow, a new group emerged, more homesteaders, and a dozen Crow warriors, alerted by the fire and summoned by the signal. They were armed, their faces grim, and they completed the circle, trapping the last of Maddox's men. The game was over. "Luther Maddox, in the name of the law, I order you to release the woman and drop your weapon," Judge Bixby commanded. Trapped, surrounded. His shield a pregnant woman who looked at him not with fear, but with pure, unadulterated hatred. Maddox lost his footing. He stumbled backward, dragging Eliza with him toward the edge of the steaming creek. In the chaos, as he tried to keep both his gun and his shield, his boot slipped on a patch of wet, superheated rock near the spring's outlet. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain. He let go of Eliza to catch his balance, but it was too late. He toppled backward, his head striking the jagged edge of the granite outcropping with a sickening crack. He slid the rest of the way into the boiling water of the hot spring source and was still. There was no final, bloody showdown, no act of vengeance. The mountain, the very land he had tried to steal and bleed dry, had claimed him. Asa rushed forward, pulling Eliza into his arms, shielding her face from the sight. The wind died down as suddenly as it had risen, and then the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hissing on the hot stones and smoldering grass, dousing the last embers of the fire, and washing the ashes of a long, dark night into the thirsty ground. The rain fell, a soft, steady baptism on the smoldering land. It washed the soot from the air and turned the ashes of the meadow into a dark, rich paste. The night's violence was over, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and more profound than the quiet that had come before. Asa held Eliza, his arms a fortress around her, his face buried in her hair as he drew in her scent of smoke and rain and life. He held her until the trembling in her shoulders subsided. The children, released from the cellar, ran to them, their small bodies burrowing into the sanctuary of their embrace. They were whole, they were safe. That was the only victory that mattered. Judge Bixby, his face grim in the new dawn, took charge. He deputized a few of the homesteaders, their faces a mixture of awe and grim determination, to assist him. Maddox's body was recovered from the spring, a final, silent testament to his own destructive greed. Rusk, Pike, and the half-dozen hired guns who hadn't fled were bound and marched down the mountain, their faces a mixture of shock and sullen defeat. The night of the vigilantes was over, and the cold, sober morning of the law had begun. The trial, when it came, was the talk of the territory. The story the Cheyenne leader published, seeded by Tess Rollins, had spread like a prairie fire, bringing reporters and federal marshals from the capital. The small Pine Gulch courthouse was too small to contain the spectacle. The proceedings were moved to Cheyenne, where the full weight of federal law could be brought to bear. Asa, now openly wearing his badge, was the star witness. He stood before the court, no longer the silent mountain recluse, but a calm, articulate officer of the law. He spoke of the land grabs, the intimidation, and the murder of his sister, his voice never breaking, his testimony a cold, hard river of facts. Eliza testified as well, her voice clear and strong as she recounted the years of exploitation under Deacon Pike, her words painting a damning portrait of his hypocrisy. Her testimony, and that of two other girls who Tess Rollins had found and encouraged to speak, sealed his fate. The verdict was swift and decisive. Maddox's remaining enforcers were sentenced to long prison terms for their roles in the violence and intimidation. Caleb Rusk was stripped of his office and convicted of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Deacon Pike, his pious mask finally torn away, was found guilty of human trafficking and fraud. His trading post was seized, its assets liquidated to create a fund for the wards he had exploited. He was sent to a federal penitentiary, a broken man who would never again use a Bible to shield a ledger book. The empire of fear that Luther Maddox had built was dismantled, piece by piece, by the slow, grinding wheels of justice. In the aftermath, a new conversation began in the territory, a conversation started by Judge Bixby. He argued passionately before the Territorial Assembly, using the case of Asa and Eliza as his prime example. He spoke of the changing face of the West, of families being built not on old-world traditions, but on shared hardship and mutual respect. He drafted a new piece of legislation, a simple but revolutionary decree known as the Household Guardianship Act. It formally recognized non-traditional family units, granting legal protection to any household, regardless of race or marital status. That was demonstrably providing a stable and safe home for children. It was a small, quiet change, but like a seed planted in fertile ground, it was the beginning of a forest. That spring, as the last of the snow melted from the high peaks and the mountain came alive with a rush of new water, Judge Bixby rode up to the cabin one last time before his retirement. He came not as a judge, but as a friend. He found Asa and Eliza on the porch, watching May and Jonah chase butterflies in a meadow now carpeted with wildflowers. "The law of the land is satisfied," Bixby said, his old eyes twinkling. "But there is another kind of law, a matter of the heart, that deserves its own record." He produced a simple marriage license from his saddlebag, there on the porch of the home they had defended with their lives, with the eagles circling high above as their witnesses. Asa and Eliza were legally married. It was not a grand ceremony. There was no preacher, no crowd. It was a quiet affirmation of the vows they had already made to each other in the steam of the hot spring. It was the world finally catching up to the truth of their family. Life in Pine Gulch changed, slowly but surely. With Maddox's corrupting influence gone, the town began to breathe again. Tess Rollins, ever the pragmatist, turned a section of her boarding house into a schoolhouse. She declared that ignorance was a worse affliction than thirst, and her classes were open to everyone, the children of homesteaders, ranchers, and, for the first time, the children from the Crow Reservation. May and Jonah attended twice a week, riding down the mountain with a renewed sense of belonging. No longer the outcasts, but a bridge between two worlds. Time flowed on, measured not in court dates and headlines, but in the turning of the seasons. The following winter, as the snow fell soft and deep outside, the cabin was filled with a new sound, the cry of a newborn. Eliza gave birth to a healthy baby boy, with his mother's determined chin and his father's dark, watchful eyes. They named him Thomas, in memory of the good man whose life had been cut short, a promise that he would not be forgotten. One crisp spring afternoon, Eliza stood on the porch, holding baby Thomas in her arms. The quilt she had started so long ago, a patchwork of their grief and survival, was now finished. It hung on the wall inside, its vibrant colors a testament to the life they had stitched together from scraps. She looked up at the cliff face. In the eagle's nest, two new fledglings were testing their wings. a new generation preparing to take flight. In the meadow, the small herds of the homesteaders grazed peacefully, their cattle mingling together on land that was now truly free. Near the stream, May and Jonah were crouched over a small pine sapling. They were showing their baby brother how to find the tight, perfect cones, their voices serious and full of the gentle wisdom of the mountains. Asa came to stand beside her, his arm settling around her shoulders with a familiar, comforting weight. He looked at their children, at the peaceful valley, at the home they had built and defended. The scars of their past would always be there, but they were no longer open wounds. They were part of the landscape of their lives, a reminder of the storms they had weathered together. Justice had not been a single, thunderous event, but a slow, patient, and persistent sunrise. And here, in the warm light of that new day, they had found their peace. They would stay in the bighorns, these people who had taken the broken pieces of their lives and, with patience and love, had built a home. They were the ones who pieced life together. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm always curious to know where my tales travel, so please leave a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. It's a wonderful way for us to connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey into the Wild West, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and giving this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please support it by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world and allows me to keep telling these stories.